Good evening. Middle school students and high school students, thank you so much for getting your parents to church tonight. I know they complained, but someday they're going to thank you for getting them here this evening. And I'm excited for the start of your faith formation year tonight. You are in for quite a ride, quite a treat this evening. When I first met Kristin at our first conversation, I think she said, she was talking about charisms, that there are natural human gifts and there are supernatural gifts where you do things only God could do. And she said, I have the charism of speaking. I said, okay, what does that mean? Well, for the last 3 days, I've sat in this church with others spellbound for an hour and a half straight, and I've seen her talk with college students. I've seen her talk with our staffs, St. Bronze and Holy Spirit, and there's something communicating heart to heart through her. And I think it'll take me, and maybe you too, a long time to unpack all that we're taking in these 3 evenings. She has a charism. I'm convinced of that now. If you agree, would you join me in thanking her for sharing her gift? What I also think is going on here is Pope Francis said once that the future of the church is going to be found in the marginalized, those people who have not been allowed to speak much in the church. That God is going to tell us what we as Catholics need to be doing and become, not by cardinals and popes and bishops in Rome, he said, but by women, mothers, the poor, the refugee, the gay and straight. All of these people we've kept silent and at a distance in the church. We need to go to the margins, he says, and there we will find God. And how about this? A mother of teenagers teaching bishops and helping pastors run parishes and dioceses. The margins are allowed to speak, or are beginning to speak, through courageous people like her. And I think we would all testify that how fresh, how life-giving to hear the gospel from the perspective of a mother feeding her children and somebody being faithful in marriage. So I think we're at the cutting edge of something big and deep in our church this evening, thanks to the courage of Kristin Bird. Please join me in welcoming her back to our pulpit here at Holy Spirit. She is going to help us sing. Okay, let us stand for our opening song, Paul. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true, with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see so many of you here tonight, some of you back, maybe some of you for the first time. So I'm going to do the same thing we did last night. How many of you have been here either Monday or Tuesday night? Raise your hand. Wonderful. How many people have not been here yet? This is your first night. Fantastic. I'm so glad that you're here. So glad that you're here to join us. So you can look around you and find the people who were here the last couple nights if you want some insight into the things that we talked about. We've been talking a lot about story and how the great story of Jesus, right, that charisma that we talked about on Monday night, intersects with the story of our lives and how God writes into our lives with this thread of himself and his gift of himself all through us and all through our lives. And that when we unpack that and discover that and like really enter into that, we can start to see our whole world a little bit differently. We actually can see God working more easily in our lives when we're attuned to that story. And so I hope that you all went home, that those of you that were here yesterday or watching on live stream, I hope that you went home last night or at some point today and started talking to people about your story of faith or asking people for their story of faith, their story of what God has done in their lives. We're going to continue on that part of the discussion tonight and talk a little bit about story, not just our individual stories of faith, but story in general and the power that story has to share the good news. So I have first to kick us off tonight a parable. This is a Yiddish parable. Once upon a time, Truth went about the streets as naked as the day he was born. As a result, no one would let him into their homes. Whenever people caught sight of him, they turned away and fled. One day, when Truth was wandering sadly about, he came across Story. And Story was dressed in beautiful clothes of wonderful colors. And Truth, seeing Story, said, "I want what you have." And Story, seeing Truth, said, "Why do you look so sad when you say that?" And Truth responded, "Oh, brother, I am sad. I am so very sad. You see, nobody wants anything to do with me. I think I'm just too old. And I'm so old that I'm irrelevant and people have kicked me out of their lives." And hearing that, Story said, "My friend, people don't run away from you and reject you because you're old. I too am old, very old. But let me tell you my secret. I'm gonna lend you some of my beautiful clothes, and you will see that sometimes people just want things prettied up a little bit." And so he lent him the clothes, and the two of them went off together and were loved and welcomed wherever they went, and they were a happy pair. So I tell you that parable because I believe this to be true 100%. Story reveals truth. Story has the power to reveal what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and what is one in the world, the transcendentals that we so often hear about, right? That story can actually reveal that to us in a way that we can accept in a little bit easier way than just the naked truth. So I have for you up here on the screen, you'll see a couple of my favorite stories. And when I say story reveals truth, I mean that it reveals truth right? With a capital T. But I also mean that it reveals truths that are true for us in our own lives. So how many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? Raise your hand if you've seen it. Fantastic. Okay, they're coming out with a part 2. I just found that out. I'm so excited. So this movie, the movie Inside Out, if you've never seen it before, the only thing you need to know about it is that those characters that you can see, the little colored people, are the emotions that live in an 8-year-old girl's brain. And inside her head, there is a control panel, and the emotions take turns kind of running different parts of her based on what she's experiencing, right, in her life. And it's a whole story that's a phenomenal thing about getting in touch with your emotions in a healthy way. Great, fine, wonderful, right? It's got all this great message. When we went and saw that movie in the theater for the first time, my youngest son, Isaac, was struggling. I can't remember exactly how old he was, but he was probably like 5 or 6 years old. And my husband and I had a boy and then a girl, and then we had Isaac. And I feel like when you have a third child, it's like God's way of saying, you thought you knew what you were doing. You've done this twice now, and you got it all down pat, and here we go. And everything about Isaac felt different. And one of the things that felt different about him when he was little was the temper tantrums, right? The terrible twos, or the terrible three, or the terrific threes, people call them. Okay. No. But he would have the temper tantrums, right? And when my 2 older kids had the temper tantrums, we learned very quickly, what do you do in response to a tantrum? You ignore it. Right? You certainly don't give in to it, because it just teaches the kid that what's gonna work to continue to get what they want is if they throw these tantrums. And with the older 2, it worked, right? They'd have a tantrum, they'd throw a little fit about something, we would ignore it, and it would end very quickly, much quicker than you ever feel like it's gonna end when it starts. But this was not the case with Isaac. See, Isaac would have temper tantrums, and he would just keep going. You would try to move away, try to redirect, right? All the things that we had learned to do, and none of it was working with him. He would just continue to get more and more and more worked up and just be screaming. And it got to a point where we would say to him, you can't scream at me like that. It hurts my ears. And if you need to go scream, that's okay, but you have to go do it in your bedroom so that it doesn't hurt everybody else's ears. And he would go up in his bedroom and he would scream until he either threw up or like passed out, falling asleep. He would scream for 45 minutes. My husband and I are like, what the heck is going on? And so we did some work with him and trying to like figure out what this was, and then they lasted way later, right? Like usually kids grow out of that around 3 or 4, end of the 3s, beginning of 4s, usually. They kind of grow out of that stage. And while they were becoming less frequent, they were just getting more intense when he's hit like 5, 6 years old. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with this child. I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to help him calm himself down. I don't know how to help him regulate, right? And I'm not sure what to do. And so this is the framework that we go in to see this movie. We go in to see this movie, and we're watching it, laughing and having a good time, and we come home and we're still talking about it, right, all of this. And sure enough, the very next day, something happened to set him off. And Isaac starts screaming. And I'm like, okay, if we're gonna scream, that's okay, but we're gonna go up to the bedroom. And by this point, I knew I had to go with him. I couldn't just leave him up there by himself, right? I had to go with him to try to help calm him down. And I go up there, and all of a sudden, it clicks with me. This movie clicks with me. And I said to him, Isaac, I said, do you remember the movie yesterday? And he's like, yes! Everything was just this like intense emotion. And I said, who's in charge right now for you? Who's in charge? In your brain, who's in charge right now? And he goes, the red guy. I was like, I agree. Right? And the red guy is the emotion of anger, right? And he's played by the comedian Louis Black, for those of you who are familiar with him, right? And he's a perfect actor for that. Yes, and I said, yes, you're right. The red guy's in charge. I felt like in this moment, I kind of felt, I'm gonna date myself here, right? But I felt like it was that scene in Ghostbusters where he looks through and he's like, I wanna talk to Dana. Give me Dana. like who's in there right now? And I said to him, okay, The red guy, we learned in the movie, the red guy doesn't solve problems. So we can't fix this until someone else is in charge. Anyone else at this point, right? We can't fix this until someone else is in charge. I will sit here with you until we can get someone else in charge. You don't have to do it by yourself, but we're not gonna talk about the problem, because that was part of the issue, right? He'd go into these meltdowns and he'd want to try to talk about the thing that got him so upset and want me to fix the issue that had triggered this meltdown. And I'm like, you can't when they're that emotional. And so I said, okay, the red guy doesn't solve problems. We can't do that until someone else is in charge. And this became like code for us with him that helped navigate through the rest of that time. What we ended up finding out was that Isaac's emotional regulator I don't know if it just didn't work or it was stuck or what the deal was, but Isaac never felt anything a little bit. Nothing. When he was mad, he was furious. When he was sad, he was despondent. When he was happy, he was giddy. He was never content. Right? Everything he felt, it was 0 to 100 immediately. But when we saw that movie together, it gave us a language to talk about what he felt like was going on inside his head. And we could talk about who needs to be in charge and what do we need to do and how do we need to navigate this and talk about what emotion you're feeling, right? All of those things. Now, Isaac turns 14 tomorrow. I promise you he does not still have temper tantrums. He's definitely outgrown all of that. He's wonderful, well-adjusted young man who's come a really long way. And actually is, of my 3 children, probably the most emotionally healthy. Because from a very early age, we were talking about how you feel and what impact that has on you, your health, and your relationships, right? Something we never even did with the other 2. But that was a movie that revealed truth, not only to me and how to break through with my son, but to my son at 5, 6 years old. He got truth out of that movie. Yes, that is what's happening inside of me. And now we can talk about it, now we can address it, now we can deal with it. So that's one of my movie stories. I can't talk about all of them, but I am gonna talk about Avengers. So I have 2 boys, which means not only do I know way more than any one person should have in their head at 43 years old about Pokemon, I also know way more than anyone should know about Star Wars. I had to watch all of the Clone Wars and Rebels with my son before Ahsoka came out. Those of you know what that means. And I know way more than anyone should know about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Okay, the MCU, right? Which started with the very first Iron Man movie, and phase 1 ended with Avengers Endgame. And now they're in, I don't know what phase they're in and what kind of, I'm done. My oldest son moved out of the house. I just cannot do the superhero movies anymore. I can't keep track. If you're gonna go back to the originals, I'll follow those guys, but I cannot keep track of this many superheroes in my brain. It's just too many. But when these movies were coming out, my oldest son was over with some of his friends from church. And we were just kind of sitting around talking. One night I think they were getting ready to go out and go do something and just happened to be hanging out at our house because we live across the street from the high school, so we end up as the hangout spot. And we're sitting there talking about different things, and we're talking about these movies, and Endgame had just come out, and everyone was excited, and they're all breaking down all of the things in the movie and all this. And one of the boys, and I'm just listening, I'm not participating in the conversation, right? I'm in the other room just listening, and one of the boys says, I think Iron Man might be my favorite hero of all time. And the other guys are like, really, Iron Man? Of all of them, Iron Man? Why him? What's the deal with him? And he said, I think his hero arc is the most true to what we actually live as humans. And then he started to explain, okay, so I'm about to spoil Endgame for you. Spoiler alert, plug your ears if you don't want to hear what happened at the end of this movie, if you don't know yet. But in the very first Iron Man movie, we get introduced to Tony Stark, this sort of playboy, philanthropist sort of ish guy, right, who does all these things and ends up becoming Iron Man and finding out his company sells all these weapons, and he kind of starts this journey onto I can't keep living life the way I was before, I need to make a change. And as these movies progress, He goes forward and backward, right? He's like all over the place. He makes huge leaps forward in some cases to be a good person, a good man who like makes the world a better place. And then other movies, he's almost like the villain, where he's the bad guy again, and he's like breaking down the bonds that this team has with each other, and he's gonna try to be a control freak and make everything happen, right? And he's like all over the place in his journey, forward and backwards and up and down and everything, until the very end of the very last movie that he's in, when he finally, at the very end, is willing to sacrifice himself to save everyone. I mean, the multiverse, right? He sacrifices himself to save. He gives his life to save everyone. And as these boys are talking, he's like, I think that's what our life is like, actually. He's like, so many stories have this nice, neat arc, right? Like it starts out great, and then it comes down, and you hit the movie low point, right? And you know that it's coming back, and it comes back, and it has this kind of nice little trails off happy ending at the end. And he said, but his story is messy. And this is what the boy said. He goes, and so is mine. But it gives me hope to know that even when I'm going the wrong way, maybe I can come back again. Or maybe when I'm doing the wrong thing, maybe when I'm the bad guy, I'm not stuck there because Iron Man wasn't stuck there. I'm like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, I wish I had been video recording this conversation, right? Like this is just boys sitting around talking about this movie series, but talk about a profound truth that this high school boy pulled out of this movie about what life is like and what our journey is like, and that there's redemption no matter what. All of these beautiful, wonderful things that were so powerful in that story. Another one that you'll see up here is, I'm going to skip the other two. If you want to know why I think that those stories are real truth, I'm happy to tell you. But we're going to go to Subnautica. And the reason I'm going to do Subnautica is because it is not a movie, it is not a television show, it is not a book, it is a video game. Subnautica is a video game. And I will tell you, I would not have believed this, probably even 5 years ago, but video games have story that reveal truth. A lot of today's video games, not all of them, all right? I'm not gonna put Minecraft in this boat. Or Madden, right? Like, sorry. But a lot of the video games today are a story that you enter in as a character. Often as a main character, right? And you go into the story and you have to accomplish things and complete the quests, or I kept calling them missions when I talked to my kids about it, and then they like get horribly offended because apparently that's not the right word. Whatever, I don't know, I don't play video games. But when COVID hit, my oldest son was he was a sophomore in high school when COVID hit, and his school went into complete virtual learning for a long time. They were in virtual learning, and he did not do well in that environment. He really struggled. We had my 3 kids, and then my sister is a healthcare professional, and her husband was an essential worker, and the two of them both still had to work. So my 3 kids and my sister's 4 kids all came and did virtual learning at my house because I work from home. So I had 7 children from kindergarten up to a sophomore in high school doing virtual learning in my house every day. Oh, it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. It was insane, right? We got through it, it's fine. You know, I learned a lot about teachers. They're incredible. And I learned a lot about my nieces and nephews and my children. But Vinny was really struggling. But because he was the oldest of all the kids, he was probably the one I was giving the least attention to, right? Like I actually had to help the kindergartner do her reading lessons over Zoom calls, right? Or had to make sure that the 2nd grader was not the one the teacher was yelling at to stop spinning in your chair and eating cheese. Like, that's not coming from my house, is it? We're like, no, okay, we're good. So, because I had these younger kids, well, all I would do is go check his assignments every so often to make sure he was doing them. Well, he was getting further and further and further behind. And we had all these different rooms in our house set up for different people, right, to do their virtual learning in. And I'm like, what's going on? Why are you not getting yours? And he's like, I'm doing it. I'm taking it. It's fine. It's going to be fine. I'll get to it. Like, I don't know what's going on. But I was so distracted, I didn't have time to really dive into it with him. And it wasn't until after COVID was over, and they were all back in school, that he finally came to me and he said, Mom, I got to tell you what happened during COVID. I was like, okay. He said, I downloaded this Subnautica video game. He said, and promise you won't be mad at me because it's done now. It's over. It's in the past. He said, but I pretty much played it straight through. He goes, you don't want to know how many hours straight I played this video game. And I was like, why are you telling me this? Why is this information that I need to have, other than just to get more frustrated? And he said, no, he said, because, he said, it's actually that game that got me out of depression in COVID. And I was like, sure. This is just your justification for wanting to spend hours and hours and hours playing this video game. And he said, no, no, no. And this is what he proceeds to tell me. And this is a story he has now shared with some other people, including at our church. He was asked to give a little testimony, and this is what he talked about. He said, this game happens in an underwater alien world. And he said, but this world is beautiful. Okay, pause. You don't hear a lot of 16, 17-year-old boys even using the word beautiful, right? So I'm like, okay, now I'm interested. And he said, it's incredible. Not just are the graphics good, but like the design is amazing, and these creatures that are created and these places that you go, and he's like, it's just so incredible. He's like, I could not believe it. It was so amazing. And I'm like, okay. And he says, so I'm sitting there playing this game. He said, I'm sitting down in this room in our house that was, we have a split level, so it was the lower level, but it's got kind of big windows where you can see outside. He's like, I'm sitting down playing this game, and I'm almost done with it. He said, I know I've almost completed the game, and so I'm just like finding side quests to do. He probably didn't say quests, because that's probably not the right word, but like finding these other things to do, because I don't want the game to be over, because this is what is keeping me from like just being horribly depressed. Because he's like, it was like the way I was numbing myself and ignoring and trying to like hide from everything else that was going on. He said, including my schoolwork and my family and just all of it. I didn't want to have to deal, so I was in this game. He said, so I'm wandering around in this game, and he goes, and all of a sudden, he said, as I turned at one point, he said, I happened to look outside. And he said, you know the oak tree that's right outside the side of our house there in the neighbor's yard? I said, yeah. And he said, I looked outside, and the sun was like doing one of those things where it like shoots the rays through the leaves of the oak tree onto the ground. I said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. He goes, and all of a sudden, I looked at this game and I said, or someone said, or in my head, I got the message. As beautiful as this game is, and as in awe of the graphic designers that worked on it as you are, and how much you are like appreciative of them, he said, it was like God said to me, I have created an even more beautiful world for you. And it is right there. It is right there. It is right outside your window. And he said, I finished the game. I closed it down. He said, I went outside. And he did. He spent pretty much the rest of COVID lockdown outside. Just out, not even doing anything outside, just being outside. Because that was what he connected with. Right? So as much as I'm not thrilled with the fact that he played straight video games for hours and hours and hours and hours, it still was a story that revealed a really profound truth to him and brought him out of this kind of depression he was in because of the situation they were in and being so disconnected. A lot of stories reveal truth to us. Right? I could go on and on. Like I said before, I love stories. So I could talk about books and movies and TV shows. That's the only video game I got because it's the only one I know about. But I know that they exist and are out there. There are stories that reveal profound truth to us if we put on that set of lenses to look at the world, right? And to look at them. My husband hates to watch certain movies with me now. We were watching the newer version of RoboCop. So there's the original RoboCop, and then there was like a reboot that was done. And he's like, let's watch RoboCop. And I'm like, RoboCop? Like, it's not that great a movie. He goes, the new one. And I'm like, it's probably even worse of a movie. Like, if reboots are, it's like any other reboot. He's like, come on, let's just watch it. It's mindless. We'll just watch him blow some stuff up. I'm like, all right, fine. So we're sitting watching the movie. And as the movie's going, all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my gosh, I said to him, I'm like, this movie's incredible. And he's like, it's really not that good. I said, no. I said, like, he is wrestling with how much of a physical body do you have to be a human? I'm like, this is incredible. Like, what makes a human a human? What makes us a person? He was like, shut up. I want to watch him blow things up. I was like, all right, I'm sorry, fine. He's like, this is not what I wanted to do with RoboCop. But this is now, because I love stories so much and I do these kinds of talks, this is how I encounter stories now, is I'm like all over the place. I'm seeing these things that are the true, the good, the beautiful, and the one popping up and coming out of all of these different stories. At least that's what I justify my binge watching television addiction for. Is that right? I'm looking for truth. No. So I want you to think for just a moment about a story that changed you. A story that made you think. A story that revealed a truth to you. It could be a book that you read, right? It could be just an article or a short story that you read or a children's book that really touched you. It could be a movie or a TV show. It could be a video game, if that's what you know, right? But think of a story. It could also be someone's life story that you heard about and inspired you. You know when you've encountered a good story, even if you're not a reader, right? Or you're not a person who sits and watches movies or whatever the case may be, you know when you've encountered a good story because you're still thinking about it when the story's over. There's something about it, even if it's just for 5 minutes afterwards, that you're kind of going, I never thought about it that way. So I want you to think about a story that revealed a truth to you. And then, because I told you this was going to happen last night, right? This is more audience participation time. Because I have all kinds of stories, but so do you. I want you to turn and tell just one person sitting next to you, okay? We don't have time for like a group of 7 to like all go around the circle and share, but just 1 or 2 people sitting right next to you, share with them a story that revealed a truth to you. You don't have to tell them the whole story if you don't have time, right? You could just tell them a story, and if you can think of it, what truth it revealed, or just a story that left you kind of thinking or changed after you encountered it. Right? Could, like I said, book, movie, short story, TV show, video game, a person's life story, whatever it might be. Go ahead and take a couple minutes and just share. Okay, take 1 minute to finish up your sharing. No problem. Okay, let's kind of bring it back together. Now, my hope is that you have many stories, right, that have touched your life. That would certainly be my hope. But if you couldn't think of one, right, particularly right now, then pay attention to the next time that a story really touches your heart or touches your life in some way. But I want to talk about, right, sometimes people will just say, oh, yeah, that's nice for you. You have all this time, apparently, that you read all these books and watch all these movies and watch all these TV shows. But I don't have that kind of time, and I'm not going to waste it on that, right? And look, it doesn't matter to me what kind of story you like. I do not like nonfiction. I don't. I am going to prefer a fiction story every time over a nonfiction story, just about. And the only time I really like nonfiction is when it's told in a particularly compelling narrative way. That's just me, but maybe that's not you. Maybe you really like nonfiction stories. Maybe you're like a biography nut, and that's like your favorite thing. Wonderful, great. It doesn't matter what kind. What touches your heart is what we're talking about. But I want you to think about this not just as, right, that these stories, when we talk about this, they're more than just entertainment. They certainly have an entertainment value, right? But they're more than just entertainment. Stories reveal truth. And story in a particular way has an ability to teach lessons and get points across in a way that is more acceptable and palatable and that people can receive a little bit easier. Story sidesteps debate, right? If I tell you that God exists for sure, that Jesus Christ came and suffered and died and rose for you, right? And now he's seated at the right hand of the Father and he's living there to bring you to new life, and you don't believe in Jesus, you will tell me why I'm wrong. You will tell me that my theology is wrong. You'll tell me that my philosophy is wrong. But if I tell you a story about what God has done in my life, you're much less likely. You're not going to look at me and say, probably, at least not in the Midwest, because we're nice, right? You're not going to look at me and go, liar, that never happened to you. Now, you might not believe the same things I do because of my story, but think about, for example, the women at the tomb, right? At the resurrection. What happened? What did they do? They went to the tomb and they found that Jesus had risen, right? Depending on which one you're reading, how they discover that, it doesn't really matter. But what happens next? They go running back to the disciples. And what do? Do they go running back to the disciples and they go, listen up, guys, you missed it. Because he said he was going to do this and none of you believed it. And here he was out there. Like, no, right? They didn't come in and start arguing with the disciples about why they had completely missed the fact that he literally had told them multiple times in the weeks leading up to it that this was going to happen and he was going to rise. What did they do? They went and they ran and they just told the disciples their story. Let us tell you what we saw. Let us tell you what happened to us, right? They didn't draw conclusions out of it and try to force those down anyone's throat. They just said, here's what happened. And that story was so powerful and compelling, it sent the disciples running. And as we all know, John ran faster because he says so, right? He tells you right there in his gospel, right? The two disciples ran back to the tomb. Peter and the one who loved Jesus, and the one who loved Jesus arrived there first. Like, yeah, of course you did, John. Anyway, but right, this is the thing. Story sidesteps debate. It gets us out of ideological and philosophical and theoretical arguments and gets us into real life and real people. Even if it's fiction stories, it still gets us into real life and real people, because this is a way we can connect that doesn't have to be about an ideology or a philosophy or a theology or any of that kind of stuff. It provokes interest for people too. When you are a storyteller, even if you're just retelling a story that you've been told, you're telling a story, people are more engaged. They're more interested. They want to know more. They're more willing to ask questions. What happened next? Well, what did you think of that, right? That's what draws you in. I will tell you that, just standing up and teaching people doesn't draw them in the same way that telling stories draws people in. Madeline L'Engle, I mentioned this at a couple of the masses this weekend. She had said, the author of A Wrinkle in Time, said Jesus was not a theologian. He was a God who told stories. We can use his example. Jesus is asked over 300 direct questions in Scripture. Direct questions, right? Nobody's beating around the bush. This is it. I have a question for you, Jesus. Do you know how many of those he gives a direct answer to? 4. And every single time, he is responding to a Pharisee. Every single time he gives a direct answer, he's responding to a Pharisee. To all the other many, many, many direct questions that he's asked in Scripture, he responds either with a question or with a story. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, once there was a man. Right? Who is my neighbor? Okay, once there was a man who set out, right? A Samaritan who set out on the road and was beset by robbers. This is what he does. He tells stories to reveal truth to people. And why does he do that? Because he knows that not everyone listening can receive that in the same way. And stories have depth. So you can take it just at the surface level, or you can dive a little deeper. And we know this because the disciples are frequently in Scripture trying to dive deeper. And Jesus is out telling these parables, and they get him by himself, and they're like, again, this is my paraphrase, right? What did you mean by that? Can you explain it to us, please? We don't understand. It's not that they didn't get the story, it's that they're looking for the deeper message. They want to know more about what it is that he's trying to say. They are ready for it. The rest of the people that were listening might not have been ready for it. But that story allowed people to enter into that truth at whatever level they were currently able to enter into that truth. So we can use his example to do that. And here's some of the things that Jesus shows us. He shows us that story can build relationship. Pope Francis says the light of faith is linked to concrete life stories. Concrete life stories. We build relationship with people when we share stories, because when I tell you the story of what God has done in my life, you respond by either wanting God to do something like that in yours, or by wanting to tell me about the time God did something similar in your life. And when we start to share these stories, it even makes it possible for people to think about that God might want to do these things in their lives. They didn't even know that was a possibility, that he could do whatever it is that he's done for you. And it opens them up to that relationship with him, but relationship with one another as well. There's a reason why, right, those ancient traditions, this is what they did, is they just sat around and told stories throughout history, because it built up that community and that relationship with one another when they did it. The other thing that story does, right, is that when you share story, you share your life. And I think I mentioned, I don't remember anymore when I mentioned this quote, but at some point over the last couple days, I mentioned this quote from St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. What he says to them is, like a mother feeding and looking after her own children, we felt so devoted and protective towards you and had come to love you so much that we were eager to hand over not only the good news, but our whole lives as well. When we share our stories of others, stories that are made up stories, but that reveal truth or have revealed truth to us, our personal life stories, other people's life stories, the stories of the saints, the stories from Scripture, when we share story with each other, it helps us to share life with one another. I love the image of the pelican that we have in the church all over the place, right? Especially because I live on Lake Winnebago and we have pelicans. I have a picture of them following my husband and I in our fishing boat recently. We were out fishing and they are like there's like a swarm of them. There's probably 6 of them right there behind the boat, just waiting for us to, I don't know what they thought we were gonna do, mess up? Like, I don't, like, they're not faster than the fishes, right? If the fish is still alive when it comes off the hook, the pelican's not gonna get it, but they sure tried. They sure tried. Right? But why do I love this image of pelicans? Because it's this idea of like a mother feeding her child, right? Panning over her own life. When a pelican mother cannot find enough food to feed her babies, she will literally take her beak and peck at herself to make herself bleed so that her babies have something to eat. Until she can get food for them. Like, right? This is what story sharing can do. And when we share the stories of our stories of faith, especially the stories that are the ones that are so personal to us, we invite that little bit of life connection with someone else. We open ourselves up to them just a little bit and show them what it means to sacrifice, to give, to be love, right? To be a gift of myself, not just myself here and now in this moment, but the gift of my whole life story for you that I'm gonna offer. This is a part of who we're called to be. And I think that sometimes we feel like our stories are too private. Now, again, right? You have to discern that. And there may be things that you're not comfortable sharing with certain folks, and that's 100% okay. You need to have good and healthy boundaries. But I don't think our problem in the church is that we don't have healthy boundaries. I don't think that's our problem very often when it comes to sharing our stories. When I was doing confirmation classes, I had a mom come in and sit down and say to me, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do because my son says he doesn't want to get confirmed. He said he doesn't believe in God. My first reaction was to say to her, it is okay. You are not alone. Like there are so many teenagers that are going through this right now, just like your son is, questioning whether or not they believe in God. Right? You're not alone. I said, we talked a little more about like, what is he asking you? What's coming up when you talk to him about it? And she said, well, he has all these big questions about how we can know that God exists. And she said, and I don't know how to answer those questions. I just know I believe in God. I don't have all these big philosophical answers that he's looking for. And I said to her, that's okay that you don't have those. That's okay. You don't need to. You don't need to. That's what we're here for, right? Me and the deacon that was helping run the confirmation program, like we can help answer those questions for him. We're happy to do that. That's what our training is in. That's what our background is in. We've learned a lot of that stuff. We can do that. I said, but you can still do something. I said, you can tell your son why you believe in God. You can tell your son what he's done in your life. And she looked at me horrified and said, I can't do that. That's private. That's private. See, she had internalized this message of silence that we talked about yesterday, right? This idea, this culture of it's not polite conversation and we don't talk about it and it's just for you. Look, our faith, our life stories, our encounters with God should be personal. But they are not meant to be private. He gives us these encounters and experiences for our benefit and so that we can go out and share them with others. It hadn't even occurred to her to talk with her son about what God had done in her life because she thought it was inappropriate with her own child. Right? This is why we have this silencing effect. This is why it's so important for us to be willing to break the silence and start sharing, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's awkward, even when no one else wants to share, and you're sitting in the small group, and the small group leader says, somebody tell me what God's done in your life, and you're the only one who says anything, and then everyone sits there and just stares at their feet. Right? That's okay. Because if you hadn't spoken up, everyone just would have sat there and stared at their feet. But now they have at least one example of something that they can draw on, one way that you've shared life with them, one way of making a new connection. Right? The other thing that story does is it actually can make space for healing. Story can make space for healing, and it can do that in a couple different ways. One, storytelling and sharing is often more intimate, right? It's not like, very rarely are you standing up in front of perfect strangers and telling all your life stories, like I get to do, right? Usually you're sharing it with someone, just a couple of you, right? Maybe sitting around a campfire, whatever the case might be, sitting around a kitchen table, in a small group, right? Like there's already a little bit more intimate setting that's happening there. And so it gives people some space to kind of share a little bit more about what they might be needing from God. It opens them up to the possibility that your life story and what he's done for you is possible for them as well. I have this clip that I'm gonna try to show. It worked before, but I have learned, doesn't matter. From The Chosen, right? I know a lot of you are super familiar with The Chosen, and one of the things I love the most about The Chosen series is how it takes these gospels that some of us are so familiar with, and it turns them into compelling stories, right? It makes it real. It makes Jesus real for us. Even if everything in The Chosen is not 100% historically accurate to what Jesus actually did when he walked the earth, it doesn't matter because there's still truth there in those stories, and they touch our lives and our hearts in a specific way. So I have this one. I have to tell you, when I saw this episode, I was freaking out. I was like, this is amazing. And I immediately went to go download a clip of it because this is right in my wheelhouse. And we're gonna see if this works.
If you knew who I am, you would never have helped me.
That's not true. This is what we Jews do. We tell and listen to stories. Our stories connect us. Tell me your story.
We ran out of money and food. My little Rebecca, I could see her ribs through her skin. And Hedva, her eyes turned gray. There had been a drought, so there was no work in town. I had a friend in Tiratana who was also in bad straits. We traveled south past Ephraim and lied in wait along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. We attacked a Jew who was traveling alone, pulled him down from his horse, took all his money and all his clothes. He fought back, so Dishon knocked him down, hit his head on a rock. I thought he was probably dead. Dishon was to take the Jews' belongings and sell them to pawn traders in Anatot. I was to ride north and sell the horse at a Roman outpost. But I wasn't on for 10 minutes when she reared up, threw me, broke my leg. I had to crawl on my elbows and forearms to the nearest town and beg for a ride back to Sychar, worse off than before. So now you know what you've done. The kind of man you've helped. Every day, I think about that Jew. Naked and alone on the road, possibly dead. I could be a murderer.
He didn't die. Somebody came along and helped him.
How do you know?
Melek. I know. I promise you, he did not die.
Why me? Why did you come all the way out here. Isn't everyone in town falling at your feet?
The shepherd leaves the 99 on the mountain to search for the one that went astray.
So, a couple things. First of all, when Jesus says, we Jews, this is what we do, I'm like, we tell stories and we listen to stories. Like, that's amazing. But then do you recognize the story that he told? Right? It's the story of the Good Samaritan, but it's the story of the Good Samaritan from the point of view of one of the robbers. And it's a story that Jesus later goes and uses and tells as the Good Samaritan story, right? So he literally, not only did he listen to this man's story, did he open that life and that space, but he was able, because he shared his story, he was able to bring healing into that place. And then Jesus is able to take that story and repurpose it. Not making this guy look like a bad guy, not ever talking about him, not ever sharing his name, nothing. Makes it sound like a fiction story that he's made up, a parable that he's made up about the Good Samaritan, right? And he shares that story with others to then bring truth to them in a different way. Like, this is the power that our stories have, to actually have people find healing. Even in the telling of their own stories or of us sharing ours with them. Excuse me. We encounter Jesus in people's stories, in people's lives' stories. We encounter Jesus sometimes in stories of the lives of the saints. That seems easier to find him, right? But we encounter Jesus in life stories of the people around us as well, if that's what we're looking for. If that's the lens that we're looking at the world through, then we're able to see God working. We're able to see him moving and the things that he's doing. And not only do they encounter him in that story, but then we get to encounter him as well. And it strengthens our faith and builds us up. There's a part in the Mass that's called the anamnesis. Anamnesis, it's a big fancy word, right? And it's never exactly there's not just one way that it comes up, but it's a part at which you'll hear Father use the words of the Eucharistic prayer. It's a part he starts using the words about memory or remembering, right? And in the Mass we call it the anamnesis. And it literally is a word, anamnesis is a word that means to remember. But it's a word that means to remember, not like, can I remember where I put my car keys, right? Or can I remember that I have to add something to my calendar, right? But it's a word that means to remember in such a way that we make it real again. See, this is the other way that stories can bring us healing. This is the other way that we encounter Jesus in our stories. I told you yesterday my story about having encountered, right, that powerful encounter in the Eucharist, of Jesus in the Eucharist on that racetrack in France at World Youth Day. And I told you, I wrote it in my trip journal and went home, and other than the first Mass I went to when I got back home, I never even thought about it again. But when I share my stories of faith, it makes them real again. It brings those moments back. It makes them real, not only for me, but for whoever else is listening to them. And it strengthens my faith. The worst thing I could have done was write it down in a journal and never tell another soul about it. Because when we tell our stories of what God has done, it makes it real for us as well. It becomes a part of us in a completely different way, even just in the retelling. This is who we're called to be. This is what we're called to do. But even more than just being who we're called to be and what we're called to do, there's actually a super practical reason why storytelling matters so much. All right, I call this my big ugly slides. I take pride in my slides because I feel like my slides are pretty. All right, and I like pretty slides. I do not like ugly slides that are just a bunch of text, but I don't know how else to do this one. So we're gonna talk for a minute now about why story matters so much, particularly in today's world, because it has a special purpose today that it didn't have in the same way previously. So the popes and the bishops, going back for decades now, and a number of other people, including a brilliant theologian that I know, have said that we are not just in an age of change, we are actually at the change of an age right now. We are at the change of an age. we're entering a new time in the world, a new time in history, completely new time. There's lots of things that can go into that, and we can break that open. But one of the things that's really key in this new time that we live in right now has to do with how we understand our life experiences. All right, so we're going to talk for a second about what I'm going to call the former context, or way of looking at the world. And then we're going to talk about what I would call now our current context, or way of looking at the world. Now, the more gray hairs that you allow someone to see, not just that you have, right, but that you allow someone to see. The more gray hairs that you allow someone to see, the more likely you are to believe that the former context or way of looking at the world is better, inherently better. And this is the way everyone should look at the world, is this former context, this former worldview. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to say, nope, the way that we view the world now in our current context, that is clearly superior to the way that people used to before. I want you to hear me say, neither one is better than the other. There are good things and challenges about both of them. They are just different worldviews, different ways of approaching the world, okay? In the former context, in the former worldview, I'm gonna say, maybe, I can't put a specific date around it, right? But let's say 50 years ago and before. Maybe even less than that, but we'll say 50 years ago and before. The way we came to understand our lives as people, particularly in, we're just gonna talk about, right, like the US, because I haven't done all the research on other places in the world, but in the US, the way we came to understand our life experience, how we were to make decisions, how we were to look at the world, was tell me what the authority is that I believe in the most, right? The authority that I trust. Tell me what the definitions, the laws, and the values are. And I will try to conform my life to my life experience, those definitions, laws, and values, right? You tell me what those things are, and that's how I'm gonna try to look at my life through that lens then. And the things that I choose to do and the way I choose to live is gonna be looked at through that lens. All right, so practical example, very practical example. When I was a baby, and I started crying, tugging on my ear, and had a fever, and my mom was trying to figure out what to do with her crying baby, what did she do? She called the doctor, right? Call the doctor. Baby is crying and tugging on her ear and has a fever. What should I do? Why? Because the way that she viewed the world was through who is the authority on this issue, who knows the most about, right, the definitions, the values, like all of that kind of stuff that go into this, and that's who I'm gonna go to find out what I'm supposed to do. I'm gonna appeal to the authority, right? Here, the person who knows the most, the person I trust the most, whatever the case might be. Now, she might have also called her mom, right? Again, though, it's, okay, what am I supposed to do here? Because I wanna know what the authority says that I should do. All right, so now we move into this bizarro world of middle ground, okay? And this is where I get to firmly sit, okay? I am part of what they call in generational research a micro-generation, which means we're too special to get lumped in with either Gen X or millennial. We get to have our own little space because, and the reason why is because the people that are in my generation, which runs from people born in 1982 to 1978, all right? It's a really short window. We were raised alongside technology. So there's a short window where technology was only available to us when we were most developmentally ready for it, right? Social media did not exist until after I was out of college. Praise God. Right? It didn't exist. I was just as comfortable in a card catalog as I was online searching. That's a unique position that we're in. So those of us that are in this micro-generation time space here, we've got this issue where we were kind of pulling from both contexts to try to figure out what we wanted to do. So what does that look like for me? My first baby gets a fever and is tugging on his ear and crying. And do you know where I go to find out what I'm supposed to do? I go to Google. Absolutely. I go to Google. Google celebrated 25 years. Yesterday or today is 25 years old, right? So it was like well established by that point, and I'm going to type the symptoms in. Now, I'm still in this former context a little bit because the results that I trust the most are going to be the ones that come from the authority that have got the definitions and values and laws, right? Like of that I understand are, that's the people I should be going to, right? So I'm going to trust the pediatrician website probably over a Reddit post, which I don't even know if it existed 25 years ago, but you understand, right? My point. So that's how I'm going to understand the world. Now, you move into today's world and today's context, and this has shifted. So a young mom today who has a baby who is crying and tugging on their ear and has a fever, do you know where she goes to find out what she should do? She goes to social media. She goes to her Facebook mom group. She goes to Instagram. She goes to Snapchat. Hey, friends. This is what the baby's got going on, and this is the question she asks. She doesn't say, tell me what I should do. The question she asks is, can you tell me what worked for you? Tell me what worked for you when you were in this position. And the people who have the most authority in their responses are the ones who can say, this is what I did and it worked for me. Because the context has shifted from a place where the authority and the definition and the values and the laws are the place that we kind of like go to for understanding our worldview, for understanding how we're called to live, for understanding what we're supposed to do, to now a place that we're in now where now the thing that makes that shift for us is personal experience. Life experience is the thing that we go to figure out how I'm supposed to live, what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to look at the world. My own life experience and the life experience of the people that I know and are around me. So I wish that this were made up, but it is not, and it has now happened 2 times. I am still in some of those mom Facebook groups, and recently, like I said, 2 times this has happened within the last 2 years. It was an ear infection situation, right? Mom comes on, here's what's got going on, baby's crying, tugging on their ear, has a fever, probably an ear infection, right? What worked for you? What did you do? And there is a mom in one of these groups who's a pediatrician. She was like, you should take your baby to the doctor because she will give you antibiotics that will help clear up the infection. There was also another mom, 2 times this has happened, that came on and said, did you know garlic has antibacterial properties? You should stick a clove of garlic in your baby's ear while they sleep tonight. Okay, it is true that garlic has antibacterial properties. That's not how they work, okay? I just want to be clear about that. Now, I'm not saying that the mom who asked the question that she listened to that answer. But in this environment, in this new context, the mom who says, I called the pediatrician and got antibiotics, and the mom who says, I stuck a clove of garlic in my baby's ear and she got better, as long as both of those babies got better, they have equal weight. Because it's life experience that matters. Life experience is the point of departure for our worldview. Now, it's probably not fair because I gave a really bad example, right? Like a really kind of crummy example for that. But this applies to a lot of different things. It's not, right, not just medicine, not just whatever. We can apply it to faith things as well. Like, right, when my grandparents got married and they were like, how are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to be as a married couple? What did they do? Well, they were both Catholic, so they went to the church and they were like, tell us how to live. And in that time, it wasn't like the internet church. It was, right? It wasn't like Google Catholic. Catholic Twitter is not where they were going. They were going to their pastor who was telling them this is what it means to live as a married couple in the church. And that's what they were trying to do. That's how they tried to live. But today, young people aren't coming to us and saying, tell me how to live. What they're doing is saying, let me tell you what my life experience of marriage has been. Here's what I've experienced of marriage. And we know that there's so many marriages that have ended in divorce, right? So many broken families, so many kids who've been raised in multiple parent homes, right? In different places and whatever. And a lot of them have looked at their life experience and said, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested. It's not because they don't want to be holy. It's not because they don't care, right? But they're like, my experience of marriage is not one I want to have. so I'm not going to do it. Now, the reason this is so important for us to understand is because this is partly why, in a different way than has ever happened before, like grandparents and grandchildren have a hard time even talking to each other. Right? Like I think back to like my grandparents, and even if I thought they were kooky or like out of touch or whatever, I still had a sense of the wisdom that they had to offer. But that's because we were both operating still out of the same context, out of the same worldview. So even if I didn't think that their, responses were super relevant, or they maybe didn't understand my life as it was, I did still trust that they had wisdom to offer, because we kind of looked at the world the same way, just in generally speaking. But today, young people are looking at their grandparents and are like, I don't care what the definitions and laws and values are. I don't care what the authority has to say. I want to tell you about my life experience. And we can't even communicate with one another because we're so looking at the world from such completely different places. But this is why, I think this is fantastic news. I know some of you, like I said, the more gray hair you have, the more depressed you are right now. And I just want you to know that this is phenomenal, outstanding, and amazing news for us. Because when it comes to passing on our faith, in the former worldview and context, what did you have to know to be able to pass on the faith? You had to know the definitions and the laws and the values. You had to know church teaching. You had to know your faith to be able to pass it on. You had to be able to defend the faith to be able to pass it on. On college campuses, 50 years ago, they were doing evangelization by teaching people the 4 spiritual laws, right? There is an objective truth, right? All of that. That's not the case anymore today. And the reason this is such great news is it means that in order to help pass on our faith, in order to help evangelize, in order to help live out this mission of introducing other people to the person of Jesus, you don't have to know all the things in order to do it. You don't have to be able to defend the church's teaching. You don't have to feel like you have a great, phenomenal grasp, right, of the theology that underpins it. What do you need to have? A life experience. You need a story. You need a story. Let me tell you what happened to me. That has power in today's world that it did not used to have. When I started out in youth ministry, which was, like 25 years ago now, that makes me feel old, right? When I started out in youth ministry, I would tell teenagers about what happened to me on that racetrack in France. And the teenagers that knew me, had a relationship with me, or kind of liked me, they would be like, oh, that's cool. Like that was right, oh. But then they would also ask pointed questions, like, so you said you felt warm. Was the sun out? They were great, right? They weren't trying to be rude. They trusted me enough to do it, but there's little holes that they're trying to poke, right? Maybe that did not happen exactly the way I said it happened. I might have embellished a little bit on it, or I might have told something, right? This is what they were doing. But I will tell you that now, today, if I share that exact same story with a group of teenagers today, they 100% believe that what I said happened is what happened to me. They might not believe all the same things because of it that I do, right? They might not come to the same conclusions that I came to because of it, but they believe that what I said happened, the way I said it happened. They're not poking holes in it. They're not questioning. This is why when we catch people telling stories that we find out weren't 100% true in today's world, the media goes nuts and is like, we can't trust anything that they've ever said because life experience is actually our point of departure for our worldview now. So if you're lying about your life experience, even if it's just because you don't remember it perfectly, but if they think that your life experience that you've shared isn't true, you're threatening everything about a worldview. This is the amazing thing about story today. Your story has power, not just because it's a story of what God has done in your life, although also because of that. But your story has power because they will believe you. They have to. They have to believe you. Their entire worldview is based on personal life experience. This is why I think this is fantastic news. And I know it's hard, and I know it can be challenging, but I still think this is really good news for us. I still think we should learn about the church's teaching. Don't get me wrong. I think it matters that we know these things, but it matters for ourselves as much as anything else, right? It matters for our own growth, our intellectual and spiritual and emotional growth to learn about the church's teaching. It does not matter as much for the need to be able to pass on the faith to others. I want to give you a really concrete example of this. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a POW in World War II. He was in the Air Force, and his plane was shot down over Frankfurt, Germany. He was 18 years old and had asked my grandmother to marry him, and then went to the enlistment office because he knew he was about to get drafted. They knew somebody who had seen the draft list, right? And rather than get drafted, he's like, I'm just gonna sign up. So he asked my grandmother to marry him. She said yes, then he went off to war. And his plane was shot down. And he was captured by the Germans and sent to prison camps. And he was sent on some of the most horrific death marches. It was towards the end of the war when they were literally just running prisoners all around to try to keep them from being discovered by the Allies as the Allies were taking more and more ground. Now, when we were younger, we knew my grandpa had been a POW in World War II, and there were 2 stories that he would tell of that time, and they were the funny, cute stories, right? Those are the only ones he would ever tell. And even my mom and her sisters, a lot of she was like, I maybe know 2 more stories than you do. He just doesn't talk about it. He doesn't want to share about all these horrific things that happened. But before my grandfather passed away, and actually before he got dementia, my mom and her sisters hired a reporter to come and sit down and interview my grandfather about his experiences in World War II. Just the 2 of them. Perfect stranger reporter and my grandfather. Which meant he would share some of these stories, right? Because this is a stranger. It's not somebody he's worried is going to hurt for him, that he had to go through some of this. And they made a cassette tape and then a CD of this interview. That's it's over an hour long, this interview with my grandfather, and then gave everybody copies, right? All the grandkids and kids and everybody got copies of this CD. And when I got my first copy of that CD, it was right after he passed away that we got all of our copies, I listened to it for the first time and was just sort of I was moved. I was horrified at some of the stories, but I was moved because it was my grandpa's voice, right? And he was gone, and he had the way of clearing his throat and all those little tiny things that were just oh yeah, that's him, that's awesome. And I listened to that whole CD, and I was like, that is so incredible, and I'm so blessed to now know some of the stories that he had in his life. And I put that CD on a shelf and never listened to it again. Right? I just didn't. I did pull out 1 or 2 of the stories when I was doing confirmation prep with teenagers, and I would talk about who do you want to be? Who do you want to be at the end of your life? Who do you want to be when the chips are down? Who do you want to be when you're really struggling? And I would share a story, and I'd be like, look, you're 16 years old. He was 18 years old when this happened. But I mean, I love you, Grandpa, but I was using his stories, right? To help other people. That wasn't for me in that moment exactly. And then my kids were born, and as they started to get older, we moved at one point, and the CD surfaced, right? And my kids are like, what's this? I'm like, oh, you never met him, but that's Grandpa Jerry, and those, he's the stories of being a POW in World War II, which the kids were like, that's fascinating. This is the coolest thing ever. Can we listen to it? I'm like, sure, you bet. And the only CD player that would play this ancient CD was the one in our van. So I stuck the CD in the van, and we would listen to it on the way to school, right? On our family trips, drives, whatever we were going. This was, instead of listening to music, we were listening to my grandpa's stories. And my kids requested that CD for years. For years, they wanted to listen to those stories. They never met him. They didn't know him. But his stories of having been in that war, they had an impact on my kids in a completely different way than they had on me, who knew him and loved him. Right? I still do love him. But his stories didn't have the same impact on me because my kids have a different worldview. I want to hang on to my memories of my grandfather, right? I want to hang on to the experiences and things I had with him, the wisdom that he passed down to us in all these different little ways. And they don't care about any of that. They want to listen to his stories from his mouth about what happened in the war. So before my son went off to basic training, his senior year of high school, he was in a U.S. world history, I don't remember, history class of some kind. And as part of the history class, they were studying World War II. And they had to write a paper for World War II. And one of the things they had to use were primary sources. And my son wrote almost his entire paper based on my grandpa's CD, tracing the marches and like all of this, of all these experiences that he had had. And then after that was done, they had to write a personal reflection on it. Like, what was this experience like for you? What did you get from it? And my son wrote a personal reflection that talked about how he hopes that he can remember how to pray the rosary when he's in basic training, because he can't take one with him, right? He said, I hope I can remember how to pray the rosary, because one of the stories that happened, my grandfather told, they used to call him his platoon, whatever, I don't know, group of people he was with in the prison camp, called him Father Jerry, because he would pray every single night before bed. He would pray every single night before bed. They would call him Father Jerry. And my grandfather is one of 15 kids. And at that time, we only had 3 sets of mysteries of the rosary. We didn't have the luminous yet, right? We only had 3 sets of mysteries of the rosary. And my great-grandmother had assigned every one of her children a decade of the rosary to pray every single day. You just have to pray your 1 decade, and if you pray your 1 decade, our whole family will have prayed an entire rosary, right? Every day. I'm like, that was really cool. So my son had started praying a single decade of the rosary, and unbeknownst to me, had gone to my mom and said, I heard Grandpa's stories about all of this. Could we do that in our family? Because my parents have currently 23 grandchildren. And some of them are too young, right? Like, couldn't quite get there, right? But 23 grandchildren. Could we do that in our family? Could we each pick a decade? If all the grandkids that are old enough picked a decade, we could do this. We could pray an entire rosary together. And Nana, I'm not going to pray a whole rosary. I'm going to be honest, but I'll pray a decade. Right? And so, again, unbeknownst to me, I find this out reading his reflection paper that his teacher gives me at parent-teacher conferences. It's like, you should read this. And like, that's how much my grandfather's story had influenced my son's life. He wanted to make sure he would remember to pray his decade, because my grandpa talked about how there were days that the only thing that got him through the day was knowing he had to pray his decade of the rosary, because his entire family was depending on it. I now know from having talked to family members that my great-grandmother, when my grandpa was missing in action, my great-grandmother refused to allow anyone else to take over his decade. Right? Like, as their siblings would pass away, someone would take over that decade, and my great-grandmother would say, absolutely not, nobody gets Jerry's decade, because if he's alive, he's praying it. That's his. And sure enough, he was. And he didn't have a rosary to pray on, right? He's using his fingers. He's figuring it out. But this is the power that stories have, right? I didn't know that story from my grandfather. That wasn't one of the ones he shared with us. I didn't know that whole history until I listened to the CD and then forgot about it because I didn't listen to it again. But our stories have the power to shape new stories in the lives and hearts of the people we share them with. This is why it matters so much. Especially right now. This is why I harp on this so much, especially right now, because this is where we are. This is the world we live in. And I'm sorry if it's hard for you and it's challenging and if you don't like it and you wish we could just go back to the other way. I can empathize with that, but that's just not where we are. So if you have a younger person that you're struggling to connect with, or if you're a younger person, have an older person you're struggling to connect with, start by sharing stories. Everybody's got them. Okay, last thing, and then I'm going to give you your assignment to kind of move forward from tonight and from this experience together. Pope Benedict said this about how important it was to know and share our stories. He said, faith is not the product of reflection, nor is it even an attempt to penetrate the depths of my own being. Both these things may be present, but they remain insufficient without the listening through which God, from without, from a story he himself created, challenges me. Our faith without our stories is dead. It's not enough. It's not enough to just spend time introspectively reflecting. It's not enough to just spend time in contemplative prayer, as beautiful as that is. We need to be sharing the stories of what God has done in our lives. We need to be looking at the stories that are in the world and consecrating them by saying, here's what's good, true, and beautiful, and one in those stories that the world is giving us. A teenage boy that came to one of our youth nights, we would do music. You could bring if you could make a case as to why this song that you wanted to play had a connection to our faith, we would play the song. That was the rule. And it couldn't have any swear words in it. Or they had to be bleeped out, had to be the radio version. If you could make a case as to how this song, so we had a kid who brought in Iron Man by Ozzy Osbourne. And we were like, dude, come on. And he was like, no, hear me out. He said, that song is a story. And that song is a story of this Iron Man who gets built up, right? And everyone thinks he's amazing. And then they all turn on him. And then he dies. And then he comes back to life. He goes, this is very similar to the story of Jesus. And we were like, all right. He goes, I just have to tell you though, then the last verse, he goes on a rampage and kills everyone. But I know that that's not part of Jesus' story. I was like, no, you're right. He's like, but this part is. And here's the beautiful thing about it, right? I cannot listen to Ozzy Osbourne's Iron Man anymore without thinking about Jesus. And I don't think any of the kids that came to that youth group anymore can listen to Ozzy Osbourne's Iron Man without thinking about Jesus. And the one kid who was like, I think we can see an example here. Something that reminds me of Jesus. This is what our stories can do. They can absolutely change the world. So as you go forth from tonight, right, we're going to go and have, I think, ice cream is what I was told. Oh, that's awesome. All kinds of amazing things. As you go, if you need to go home, that's great. I would hope that you will stay. But this is what I want you to do. I want you to share a story of faith from your life with someone. Today, tonight, okay? If you don't have anyone at home, then don't go home yet. Share it with somebody here first, right? And if you've got somebody at home, wake them up and tell them, I got to share a story with you, right? Share a story of faith with someone. Remember the format we talked about last night. I was, Jesus did, now I am. It does not have to be your whole life story. It does not have to be a big, amazing St. Paul, right, knock me off my horse moment. It can be a small interior thing that happened. Focus on how you were before, what Jesus did to bring you healing, wholeness, restoration, to give himself to you, and how that changed you for afterwards. Because I promise you these stories will change the world. They will change our culture. They will change the hearts and lives of the people, not just in our parish, but in our homes and in our schools and everywhere else that we go. Because they're going to believe you. They're going to believe you that what you said happened the way it did. Thank you so much for listening to my stories and my sharing with you, and I hope that this was beneficial for you. But I want you to know that, as great as you think it was, and as much as I get a lot of positive feedback, and I'm so appreciative of it, if you don't actually go and share a story with anyone, then I might as well have been a clanging gong or a resounding cymbal tonight, all right? This is what matters, is put it into action, all right? Okay, so share and come and have treats and all the wonderful things. I will have more resources for storytelling and things like that on our website. You can come get a business card. I've got them up here on the podium. If you need the website address, if you have questions and want to talk to me, please come let me know. But thank you all so much for your time and attention and all the sharing.